So, in the kind of what's next sort of discussion, you mentioned that the heroic and mythic dungeons were really going to be pushed up in their both difficulty, requirements, and is there going to be anything for newer players to kind of catch them up?
Yes.
Because there is that big item level.
Well, yes. Our thinking is that normal dungeons in 7.2 will stay exactly as they are, but they will drop 825 gear, which is current heroic gear. So if you're freshly dinged 110, that will just help catapult you up a bit faster, which is standard with how our past patches have gone with making catch up and just getting into the latest content more straightforward.
Okay, fantastic.
Along those same lines with dungeons, can you talk about the new 5-man dungeon, some of the story behind it, and the mechanics that we might see inside of it?
Sure. So it's a 4-boss dungeon called the Cathedral of Eternal Night, and as mentioned in the panel, it's centered around climbing the spire. So what we're going to find is that we need to use the pillars of creation that we have obtained from throughout the Broken Isles to unlock and gain access to the very depths of the tomb where the Fellstorm originates. And we're going to use those pillars in locations scattered around the entire structure. One of those locations is actually in the dungeon. So in the raid, we're going to be going to different wings and plugging in the Tidestone or the Tears of Balloon, but we're bringing the Aegis of Agrimar to the top of the dungeon. And so that is our objective. We're going to take it to the very top, insert it into a receptacle, and that will unlock the first step of a multi-part lock that will eventually lead us to the Avatar himself.
So gear especially, mainly focusing on kind of necks and rings, and you were saying that you wanted to kind of make gearing a bit, better, I suppose, in 7.2. Currently, let's take the example of a neck piece. If it drops socketed, you could find yourself sitting there passing out upgrades that are 50 plus item levels higher, purely just because it is the better neck piece. Is there any kind of plans to go back to including agility, strength, and so on?
So it's an option that's on the table. I think we honestly see it as a little bit of a last resort, because lost in a lot of this discussion is the fact that in terms of their value as slots, rings and neck are some of the weakest individual slots compared to chest, legs, helm, etc. Letting them be focused and have all their budget spent in secondary stats makes them potentially more interesting, obviously also potentially more imbalanced. But going back to a world where they're just the same distribution as any other armor piece, your ring, unless it was something very special like the legendary ring, was actually one of the least important slots in your character. We'd rather look first to large disparities in secondary stat valuation. For example, there are many specs for whom mastery is their worst stat. It feels like if mastery is ever your worst stat, we're doing something very wrong. It's a custom tailored stat for your spec. So there's probably straightforward tuning approaches and changes there. And so I think that will help in this regard. I think there's other things we're looking at also in terms of how secondary stats on items scale in general. We've been much more aggressive up front with how many secondaries appear in items because we want to get people to a certain baseline level of things like crit and haste that make their characters feel better. But then the amount and the rate at which your secondary stats grow past that actually slows down as you go deeper into the expansion, as you start looking at Nighthold gear, Tomb of Sargeras gear, and beyond. And so that will also help shift the balance back between primary and secondary and other slots.
This one might actually work for you here. Can you talk about the assault base and how it's going to work? Is it going to be similar to what we did in Suramar rebuilding with the Nightfallen, or is it like a completely different sort of mechanic?
Like Ian mentioned in his panel, it's going to be more like patch
2.4.
2.4, thank you. I was like 4.2, that's wrong. Patch 2.4, where the players work together towards a common goal. They'll be able to choose which one they can work towards, and as a group, the players in the entire region will move towards unlocking these things.
That's cool.
And yeah.
So will you crash the server some more?
No, let's not do
Well, minus that part.
Minus that part.
Yeah.
I was there all night.
But unlike that one, that one was much more rigid, and like Isle of Thunder is very rigid. This is really going to be driven by the players, so it'll be in response to player actions, player donations, whatever you want to think of it as.
Essentially, get to pick how things go.
Yes, and people will be looking at it like, okay, this tower will give us these abilities, this thing will give us these abilities, this thing will give us these abilities. I want to do that one, whereas you're like, I like this other one.
You can go do whatever you want to do. It's still going to work towards it.
Yep.
Okay.
Actually, just on that topic of kind of server stability and so on, I think we can kind of agree that this is probably one of the best, if not the best, launch that a World of Warcraft expansion has actually had. Is this, I suppose, the norm that we can expect now? I know it's difficult to factor in everything, but was this due to was it due to maybe technology upgrades, planning, or do you just feel like it kind of just went well, basically?
A whole lot of work went into it. A lot of planning, a lot of technology, and we will continue to improve our server architecture and our gameplay systems to support the number of players and the game design that folks like designers Ian come up with. So it's not an accident. It's
Exactly.
Best accident ever? No, it was not an accident. It's the result of a lot of hard work by a lot of really some of the most talented people I've ever had the opportunity to work with.
Yeah, our server engineers in particular knocked it out of the park.
Yeah.
And it's a process that began with Warlords launch. It's a process that began with a postmortem of Warlords and asking how can we make sure this doesn't happen next time. And it's also thanks to a lot of the efforts and the time contributed by our players on our beta realms. We did something we haven't done in the past, where we kind of actually ran through a few dry runs of the process of launching the game. Like, hey, we invited a ton of people to our beta and said, everybody go to Dalaran at 3 p.m. on this Friday. We're going to flip the switch. And some things crashed and things melted. We fixed those problems. And then we did it again. And we did it again. And it turns out when you practice things and rehearse them, they're more likely to go well.
I want to kind of move over to a little bit of story stuff, actually. What's going on with...
Back to you, Ian.
So what's going on with Jaina, the other Horde Alliance leaders? The story between Greymane and Sylvanas kind of ended abruptly. That can't be the end of all of it. I mean, we haven't focused on any of them in a while.
I mean, I think the answer that there are definitely simmering tensions between the Alliance and the Horde. Jaina is off doing her own thing, doing stuff. She will not be a part of a Kirin-Tor alliance that includes the Horde, given her history with what happened to Theramore in particular. And there's definitely no love lost between Greymane and Sylvanas, and that's a conflict that's going to continue to play out. But I think what we're seeing in 7.2, and as I alluded to in the panel, this is not Alliance and Horde, Red and Blue coming together and holding hands to vanquish Deathwing or the Lich King.
Doing their own stuff in the back.
Yeah, this is us succeeding through perseverance and the will and determination of our class orders, despite the lack of cooperation between the factions.
Just sort of touching now on kind of gearing and stuff like that. The kind of Titanforged and Warforged, it changed a great deal in Legion, and we're at a point now where you can be sitting there killing a world boss or whatever it may be out of far, and you'll get these very these fantastic pieces of gear. Do you feel that the system could be improved on, given that right now, let's say your kind of top end players have to sit there and basically cross their fingers and pray that the perfect item that they need with the perfect stat rolls will roll that tiny chance of getting a huge upgrade?
So of course it can always be improved. I think it's interesting though that you say they have to. So there is the possibility of randomness to help you out. There's always the possibility of that amazing Titan Forged item. I saw someone in trade chat linking a 895 socketed Raid Finder piece, and it's like, look, that person won the lottery basically. Like literally, that's well over 1 in a million odds of that happening. But it can happen. But the places where you get the best gear are still the hardest content. They're still killing mythic raid bosses, clearing mythic 10 dungeons, and opening your weekly chest, and people still look forward to those moments. And when you look at people who, if you look at raiders and top guilds, there were mostly a mix of high-end gear, and then occasionally maybe you might have that World Quest piece that got ridiculously Titan Forged, but that's the huge exception to the rule. And I think overall we're pretty happy with how it's played out. We don't see players feeling obligated to run every trivial content or do every world quest that awards items, because theoretically it could Titan Forge. Most people don't do that. Most people might do their artifact power world quest, they're giving a guaranteed reward, and maybe you'll do an item world quest if it's like a relic or Devil's Sword Shock Baton or something, but that's the exception to the rule. So I think by and large the best gear comes from the hardest content. The best geared players in the world are the ones who are doing the hardest content. You can look at WoW Progress or other sites that are like offering rankings of everybody by item level, and consistently, it's not the random guy who does LFR and got really lucky. It's the person who's in a top world guild. So it's playing out in that way. But on the other hand, every player has these moments of excitement. For that person who mostly has 840 gear, 845 gear from World Quest or from Raid Finder, when they do get that ridiculous Titan Forged piece, it makes their day. It's not hurting the overall balance of the game, and that person just had a great moment because of it.
Speaking a little bit on the World Quest system and what it takes to do the sort of scaling that we see in Legion, I know we spoke before, I think actually it might have been last BlizzCon, about the potential of doing the scaling across the rest of Hazzikostas. Is that still something that's on the table, and if so, what would it take to get it done?
It's on the table. It's a lot of work. That's really all that it boils down to. It's something we'd love to do. It's a huge undertaking. Yeah. It's, we built a lot of Legion around this scaling framework, and the old content would need to be retrofitted.
Is it something you would do going forward, basically, from now on?
I think it's almost certainly something that we're going to do going forward, and it's something we want to work on backward facing, but it's something we probably need to chip away at in stages, because it's a very big undertaking to just go do it all. It's both creature combat, the dungeons, all the itemization from all those dungeons and quests, but then also the quest logic of, well, you need to be this level to go to this zone, or you need to have done this to do that zone, or so forth. In a world where things are now open-ended, that needs to be reflowed in a lot of cases and still make logical sense. It's all doable. It's just a question of finding the resources to make it happen without it detracting from development of forward-facing, cutting-edge content.
Will there ever be some kind of system in place where you can essentially re-roll your Mythic Plus Keystone, so that, let's say you have a comp that specifically focuses on a certain dungeon, I know you're a group of 5 friends, and you've now got a keystone that basically just is impossible. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult for the group that you run.
I don't think so. I think you can level up someone else's keystone and see what that one turns out. I think the randomness of which dungeon it points to and the variation from week to week with affixes is designed deliberately to be somewhat disruptive to static comps, to avoid the perception that arose in challenge modes a lot of the time in Warlords, where there was a sense of this is the single best composition. It's hard to answer that question, what is the best Mythic Keystone comp? Because it will depend. Well, is it Necrotic Week? Is it, Raging? Is it Tyrannical? Is it Fortified? Are we talking about Law? Are we talking about Halls of Valor? All these different variables come into play, and there can be different answers.
Speaking of specific classes, you talked a lot about how the Hunter is going to be getting back some of its utility, and traps are going to be spreading to the other specs. Can you talk about, you can sort of describe that and maybe shed some light on some of the other classes that are getting utility back as well?
I think I don't want to say anything that's inaccurate, so I'd rather wait until patch notes and a more exhaustive list. It's something that we're discussing as a team. The class team is digging into this very actively. Those are a couple of examples that we're confident enough in to be able to say for sure are happening, but they're examples of how we're approaching our thinking. And to be clear, it's not going to be some massive, de-pruning, everybody gets tons of stuff back. There are plenty of specs that are perfectly fine in terms of the amount of utility they have, the amount of control they have. There are just a few places where we cut too close to the bone.
Okay.
Just in regards to the micro holidays, I believe the term was. So, are there any plans to essentially use them to kind of honor events that happen within the community that were kind of quite notable?
Running of the gnomes, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
that could be really cool. That could be really cool.
I guess the best example I can think of is the world first Lich King kill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that video kind of it happening has been thrown around. Everyone's seen it. It's this incredible moment, and I suppose this is kind of 2 questions rolled into one, but perhaps introducing kind of time walking in raids is something that's been
Jenkins Day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Roy Jenkins Day.
And it's is it something that could maybe be used to honor that, I guess?
Well, okay, so I don't think the 2 would be one and the same. I think definitely honoring notable events. I could actually imagine.
Corrupted Blood.
Exactly. I was about to say that. Right. The Corrupted Plug, Zul'Gurub Plague Day. Right. Also, about not sure if we're doing it, but I could totally see us commemorating. I think it was Galahad was the name of the player on the Medivh server who was the first one to ring the GOG, the very first Scarab Lord. Would be cool if there was some recognition of something like that, or Paragon's, heroic Lich King kill. Because it's the story of World of Warcraft, the story of Azeroth is one that's been shaped as much, if not more, by the players than by its developers and creators. That said, I don't know that time walking is the right way to do that for raids. Time walking raids are something that we'd love to do at some point. There are a lot of challenges in terms of figuring out exactly how that fits into the existing structure, but would be fun.
I have to ask this for my news editor that's back home because she's a Blood DK player and a Master Monk. She wants to know very specifically what improvements you might be making to make them more viable tanks in Mythic and raids.
We just brought back Ice Bound Fortitude for Blood Death Knights in 7.1 just last week, which is pretty huge. That's basically another major cooldown on top of your toolkit. And we're seeing, with that, I think they're in a competitive place. I'm going to be controversial and say I think Brewmasters are actually really good and they're underrated.
Oh, she's gonna have to email.
It's funny. So, without giving too much away here, like as a Mythic Raid Guild person, I have a Blood Death Knight and a Brewmaster tank as the two tanks in my guild.
That's good.
The Brewmaster tank. So Brewmasters, they're one of the least played specializations, just because Monk. They're a new class added later on. You have to level them up from scratch. There are fewer monks than a lot of other established tanks. We find a lot of tanks are people that have played the same class for years and years and years. Tanks don't switch around as much as many others. So many people don't have as much experience with Brewmasters and healing Brewmasters. And so it's all too common to run into a Brewmaster in a dungeon group, and you're like, well, this Brewmaster, I can never keep them topped off. They're always at like 50-60% health, no matter what I do. This is frustrating. This is crazy. This guy's really squishy. And it's like, well, is he dying? No, but I can't top them off.
It's an OCD thing.
Yeah, and so you don't have much experience with learning how they play and just the nature of stagger mechanics and all that. I mean, I think stagger is one of the most incredibly powerful tools in the game. It's actually fun. I mean, comparing Brewmaster and Blood Death Knight, right? Go fight Cenarius and have him hit you with the Spear of Nightmares. And good luck as a Blood Death Knight if you don't have every conceivable timer up. And then the Brewmaster does nothing, and like a tiny little pool spawns because, they just staggered all the damage. And yes, in theory, there might be a little bit more healing required in terms of like some of the HPS metrics that you look at on Warcraft logs or the like. But as a lot of healers will tell you, that's actually easy, non-stressful healing. You don't have to worry about, like HOTS will take care of that, but they're not going to get spiked down. They're not going to have those bursty deaths that other tanks very commonly do. And so I think it's just a matter of, players giving them more of a chance, which is hard for us to say. And I think more education, more information about how the spec plays. We made a couple of tweaks to them in recent hotfixes, increasing stagger, trying to nudge players in the direction of checking the spec out and giving it a try. But they're very potent.
Just on the topic of kind of class balance, is there any attention paid towards the balance of difficulty and then the whole kind of reward versus, I suppose, difficulty? Should kind of a class or spec that is very difficult have the potential to be better than something that's very easy, or is that factored in at all?
It is a little bit. Certainly, when it comes to things like talent choices, if you have a passive option versus something that's more active, we tend to prefer the active one to maybe have a higher potential if it also has more room for mistakes. That's not always the case. If people look at Demon Blades as a counterexample for Demon Hunters, for example, but it's tricky because we don't ever necessarily want to tell someone, well, your spec isn't mechanically complex, therefore you can't be as good as the other players. It's more that we offer different levels of complexity and different play styles for different player preferences. Some people like maintaining the uptime of the buffs and debuffs. Other people like a more reactive proc-based rotation. Other people like something that's more, of a sequence or priority-based thing. And those can be easier or harder, but we want to offer outlets for all types of players. Certainly, community perception can often be driven by skill cap or skill differential. That's something that we're mindful of. I think Discipline Priest are a great example of this. Discipline Priest is probably one of the highest skill cap specs in the game. We've seen amazing, I think they're one of the specs that probably has the most success healing Mythic Keystone 15 runs, but a Discipline Priest who isn't really familiar with the spec and isn't comfortable juggling offense and healing and tries to play it like a more traditional healer can have a very rough time. So a lot of people go into dungeon groups with less prepared, less experienced Disc Priests and get a negative impression of the spec, but then at the other end, there are people making it shine. It's cool that the person can make it shine, but definitely a concern for us when it fuels a negative perception of the class. And so we often worry more about the skill floor than the skill ceiling. If making mistakes can lead you to a place where you're just frankly terrible and can't perform the role, then that's more of a problem than if the truly expert player has room to kind of distinguish themselves at the very high end.
When it comes to the artifacts and the fact that you're now going to be able to use your order resources to buy artifact power and stuff like that, that's a great change to make playing alts a little less daunting. Are there other changes that you think need to be made still to make alts a little bit easier for someone who doesn't want to,
Yeah, I think
you know where I'm going?
we'll be keeping an eye on it. I think so. So just to be clear, it's artifact knowledge
Artifact
that you'll be able to. Yeah,
knowledge.
exactly. So it's the person that you bring your resources to start those research orders.
Yes.
They'll have a vendor list on them. You can get, let's say, up to 10 points of knowledge just by handing them resources, and then from that point on, it's back to work orders. But you've closed the gap tremendously. So I think artifact power are an area where we know it's important both for alts, but also someone who just picks up the game for the first time. Like if you get the game as a present over the holidays and you don't want to feel hopelessly behind, it's essential that you can get caught up.
Yeah.
Similarly,
Or even
just
multiple
item level.
specs.
Yeah, exactly.
Within your own class.
Yeah, and same with item level, and same with also number of legendaries. I think over time, months from now, the norm is that people have. Well, you'll get there. But months from now, if the norm is, well, a lot of people have 2 or 3 legendaries, well, now suddenly, it's important that you be able to get your first much faster than people did when they were just starting out. And so all of those things are going to be things that we're keeping an eye on and rolling out systems or increased rates to let people feel like they can get caught up, switch mains, switch specs, whatever.
Oh yeah. So if you guys want to do like maybe one last question each or something.
Okay, yeah. So towards the end of your kind of presentation, you were talking about sort of after the Tomb of Sargeras and Argus and things like that. And I was just wondering, are we heading towards a point where the team kind of feels that order halls are no longer required? We're kind of at a point now where order halls are sort of, there is still, we go there, we do our kind of artifact stuff, but for someone that has completed the campaign and kind of has moved past sort of, there's more kind of, the things to do in there, it means that they're slowly moving slightly towards that kind of irrelevance that Garrison's kind of hit. I mean, I personally still do love the class order halls, but are we reaching a point where the team will basically say, we're moving to Argus, so we basically just leave the order halls?
I think it's likely that throughout Legion, your order hall remains your base. It's the place where you're leveling up your artifact, where you're running missions, doing all those things. I think certainly it's intentional that the progression tails off a little bit. Early on, you're unlocking new traits, you're speccing out your order hall, unlocking new champions. That's not going to continue at that same rate, but it still feels like a focal point for your past fantasy and past mission in the Legion expansion.
I doubt I'm going to get an answer out of this, but can you talk more about Argus? And how that will go down?
Not much.
Even if it's not Thor specific.
No, we'll be going to Argus in patch 7.3, and we wanted to make sure that it was very clear that the Tomb of Sargeras is not the end of Legion's story. There's a lot more to follow. It's almost impossible to get into anything more detailed about it without major spoilers of 7.2, which we don't want to do. We'll have a lot more to say on that front in the future. It's going to be an epic patch, but it's just wanted to let everybody know it's out there on the horizon, and we're trying some pretty ambitious things with Legion.
Cool.
Oh, fantastic.